For the first time, as I stepped on Soviet soil, I felt myself a full human being. A full human being. So it is unthinkable to me today that colored peoples in any part of the world would ever join a war or attacks upon the Soviet Union.
Welcome to Amusing Jews, where we celebrate Jewish contributors and contributions to American popular culture. I'm Jonathan Friedmann.
And I'm Joey Agelfield.
Producer-engineer Mike Tomren is working somewhere behind the scenes. Amusing Jews is a project of Adat Chaverim Congregation for Humanistic Judaism, the Jewish Museum of the American West, and Atheists United Studios. Hey, Joey. As much as it pains me as a historian to admit, many people find history boring. That's where historical fiction comes in.
We're delighted to talk with Alina Adams, a New York Times bestselling author whose latest historical novel is Go On Pretending. Alina, welcome to Amusing Jews.
Thank you so much for having me. I've been stressing all week whether I'll be amusing enough.
You were born in Odessa, then part of the USSR, and immigrated to the United States at age 7. You learned to speak English by watching American soap operas. What attracted you to soap operas?
Well, it took me a while before I figured out the answer to that question. When I was younger, I just thought, I liked the fact that things were happening. But as I got older, I realized that, so here's what basically happened the year that I turned 7 years old, just to give you some perspective. So first of all, we left the Soviet Union on September 20th. Now, in the Soviet Union, September 1st is the first day of school, and it is a major deal. All the kids dress up. You've seen the kids with the huge bows on their hair. Everybody has flowers. Everybody's rushing to give them to their teachers. It's the biggest holiday of the year if you're 7 years old, and it's going to be your first day in first grade. But here's the thing. My parents knew that we would be leaving the country on September 20th. I didn't know. They didn't tell me because they were afraid I would tell someone else. And that could lead to all sorts of amusing Jewish problems. So I didn't know, but my parents figured that since they were leaving on September 20th, there's no reason to send me to school. Come on, for 3 weeks? They don't have the time for this. So I had already had the uniform. My grandmother had sewn the lace on it. It was lovely, take my word for it. But there it is. It's September 1st. It's the most exciting day of the year, and I'm sitting at home like the village idiot. So that's September 1st. Come September 20th, we are getting on a train for what I think is a little trip. My grandparents are crying hysterically. Why? I don't know, because nobody has told me anything. So we get on a train, and at some point, I honestly do not remember when, I am informed that this is not a little trip. We won't be coming back. So we go through Ukraine, we go through Poland, we go through Austria, we spend 4 months living in Italy where we get our paperwork processed, we go to New York, and then we end up in San Francisco, California. So it would seem that the year I turned 7, I did not have a lot of stability in my life. And perhaps a television show which airs 5 days a week, always at the same time, featuring the same people, where something happens and then people talk about it endlessly? Perhaps, just perhaps, that was something that a child who had had just a little bit of upheaval in her life really, really needed.
That's really interesting. And getting into soaps at age 7 seems a little bit young as well.
Well, I was a little older, but here's the thing. You have to remember, 1980 was the summer of Luke and Laura. Everybody was watching soaps. So I think everybody of every age was watching soaps. Did I understand them? No. But, pretty colors and people, and as I mentioned, stability.
Speaking of soap operas, your 2006 novel, Oakdale Confidential, a tie-in to As the World Turns, was a New York Times bestseller. I imagine there were a lot of rules you had to follow when writing a book based on a popular TV show.
Well, I was working for As the World Turns and Guiding Light at the time, so it's not like I was just randomly writing it. But yes, the main thing is that the wheels of publishing grind very, very slowly. And television shows like soaps are not written that far in advance. They're written about 6 weeks out, whereas a book manuscript has to be delivered about a year in advance. And also, we were working to hit a very hard date because in 2006, As the World Turns celebrated their 50th anniversary on the air, so we did not have a lot of wiggle room. So basically, I was writing a story about characters on the show who, at the time that I was writing the book, I did not know what they would be doing at the time that the book was released. And I mean, I worked with the head writer and I worked with the executive producer. So it wasn't like I was just making things up, but yes, it was a lot of moving pieces that we had to coordinate. And also, the book was technically written by a character on the show. The conceit was that a character on the show had written a tell-all novel, like Peyton Place back in the day and all of those things, had written the novel. So my name was in really, really tiny letters at the bottom, and at the top was actually the imaginary character's name. And here's the thing, when you collaborate with an imaginary character, they don't do any work. I had to do all the heavy lifting.
That makes sense. So was it kind of a imaginary story in the sense that it didn't necessarily need to follow the continuity of the show?
Yes and no. It needed to follow the continuity because the idea was the character had fictionalized the lives of real people that she knows while incorporating real elements. And by real, that means real on the show, not in real life. So, yes and no. The most difficult thing, though, was that because I was writing about characters that were also on the show simultaneously, I couldn't have a character arc which changed them too much. So I basically had to do a whole book where the characters went through a lot of things, but ended up at the end right back at the beginning because the characters could not be changed from what was on the air. So I was writing a character arc with no character arc.
I'm glad you mentioned that because I read a lot of Star Trek novels, and that's exactly what happens in every one of them.
Yeah, I love tie-in novels. I started with the Star Trek novels back when James Blish was doing the novelizations of the episodes. And of course, I read all the ones of the movies and all of that. And yes, and in fact, I contributed a chapter to a book of tie-in writers, I think about 15 years ago, that Lee Goldberg, who put together, who also started the tie-in writers of America. And that was exactly what I wrote about in my chapter, was how difficult it is to write a novel where things happen to a character, where those of us who write novels, people have to change. That's a story. Something has to affect a person and they have to change. But those of us who write tie-ins have to write stories where the characters go through multiple things and change, but yet remain exactly the same.
Enjoying the show? Click like and subscribe. You later turned to writing historical fiction, mostly about experiences of Soviet Jews. Is this a way to reconnect to your roots or better understand your own family's history?
Well, first of all, it was just a very practical move because I've written a lot of different things. I wrote soap opera tie-ins. I wrote a series of figure skating murder mysteries. I've written Regency romance novels and contemporary romance novels. I've written some nonfiction. So basically, I'm a bit of a literary whore. If you pay me to write something, I will write it, and I'm very comfortable. I embrace that distinction. But the main thing is that I was having lunch with the woman who was my agent at the time, and she said two things to me. She said, first, Russia is really hot right now. And I said, oh, I can't imagine why. I don't know what is possibly going on in the world that could make Russia hot right now. And then she also said that she had been talking to editors, and they told her that they were getting tired of World War II novels, that they felt that they had pretty much told every story there was to tell. And I said, so you want me to write a story about Jews suffering, but you'd like me to do it in a different time and place? And she said, yes. And I said, I can do that. So the first historical fiction novel that I wrote was called The Nesting Dolls, and it took place in Odessa, USSR in the 1930s, which was during Stalin's Great Terror. Then it took place in Odessa, USSR in the 1970s, which was during the Jewish Refusnik movement. And then it took place in 2019 in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn, which is a very heavily Russian Jewish area. So I was able to get the suffering in. Jews suffering, always good, but not World War II. Well, it goes up right against up the border of World War II. In fact, the first section literally ends with the Nazis bombing Ukraine.
Your 2022 novel, My Mother's Secret, takes the reader into the Jewish Autonomous Oblast, which was established by the Soviet Union in 1934 and remains one of two officially Jewish jurisdictions in the world, the other being Israel, although the Jewish population of the autonomous region has shrunk to only about 800. Could you tell us about this region and why you set a novel there?
Well, first of all, it was an offshoot of the Nesting Dolls, because as I mentioned, the first part of the Nesting Dolls takes place in the 1930s. And the feedback that I got from readers was that was the part they liked best because it was the part they knew least about. So many people said to me, for obvious reasons, Western Europe gets the bulk of the press through the 1930s and the 1940s. And people said to me, I had no idea what was going on in the Soviet Union. The fact is, if there had been no World War II, Stalin would have set his own personal record for killing his own citizens and other people. So people were fascinated by that. So I decided when I was doing my second Soviet historical fiction, I would focus on the 1930s. And I had read a nonfiction book by Masha Gessen called Where the Jews Aren't, The Sad and Absurd History of Barabajan. And also, here's a little tip. While if someone says to you, do you want to release a book in a pandemic? Go, not really. But on the other hand, if you have to research a book during a pandemic, it's fabulous because you have nothing better to do. So I went down the rabbit hole that is YouTube, and I was able to find documentaries on Barabajan. My personal favorite fun fact about Barabajan is that it was a gift given to the Jews by the great friend of the Jews, Joseph Stalin. The idea was that it would be a Jewish homeland under the auspices of the warm, loving embrace of Stalin. As you said, it was established in 1934. And so there are documentaries that have historical footage. In fact, I was able to find on YouTube a movie called Seekers of Happiness, which was a Soviet propaganda film made mostly in Russian and Yiddish. And my mother remembers having seen parts of it that was supposed to convince people to move to Barabajan. And if you look it up, it's available completely on YouTube. It's called Seekers of Happiness. And I was able to find more modern day documentaries about what it looks like. My favorite part is, as you said, there's very few Jews left in the region. Mostly it's ethnic Chinese and ethnic Koreans because it's located right on the Russia-China border. And so in this one documentary I found from 2012, there was footage of these adorable, tiny Asian children in their classroom singing happy Yiddish songs. Because as the teacher explained, we are studying our region. Everybody studies, my city and all of that. And she said, this is our history. So these absolutely adorable Asian children are singing in Yiddish.
Your newest book, Go On Pretending, spans 3 generations of Jewish women, travels back and forth between the Soviet Union and the U.S., witnesses the birth of television and the fall of the Soviet Union, and culminates with the women's revolution in Syria. What inspired you to write this story?
Well, remember how My Mother's Secret, a novel of the Jewish Autonomous Region, came from the 1930s section of the Nesting Dolls. In My Mother's Secret, a novel of the Jewish Autonomous Region, I make almost a passing reference to the fact that there were Americans who sold their property in the United States and moved to the Soviet Union, to Barabajan, because they thought it was going to be their one opportunity to establish a Jewish state, because it's 1934 and anything else would be completely ridiculous. And people said to me, I don't believe you. People said to me, I do not believe that Americans would move to the Soviet Union. So I said, I'm going to make you believe it. I'm going to write a book where a section of it is about Americans who moved to the Soviet Union. But of course, when you do that, you have to come up with motivation. Now, while on the one hand, I claim that historical fiction is the easiest genre in the world to write, that's because you don't have to think of what happens. It's already happened. All you have to do is steal from history and then put characters in it and give them motivation. So I was trying to think of what would motivate people to move to the Soviet Union. I didn't want to do the 1930s again because I didn't want to do World War II, which I do quite a bit of in My Mother's Secret, a novel of the Jewish Autonomous Region. So I wanted to start with the 1950s. Also, when you do a family saga and you want the character from the first generation to still be alive, you can't have the events span 150 years. It just doesn't work that way. So I started in the 1950s. And one of the things that they always tell writers, here's a quiz. What's something that all writers are told?
Write what you know.
Write what you know. So I started thinking about what would motivate someone to move to the Soviet Union from America. Write what you know. So I looked around my house and I saw my husband. My husband is African American. Now, my husband and I got married in 1999. We've been together since 1997. And as we like to say, by the time we got married, nobody cared. I mean, there are people who care. I'm absolutely sure that there are still people who care, but as a rule, we live in New York City, nobody cares. On the other hand, for instance, where we live in New York City, the couple who lives below us got married in the 1960s. Back then, people cared. My husband's best friend from college had one black parent and one white parent who got married in the early 1960s. People cared. In fact, they had to go to Washington, D.C. to get married because the state they were living in, it wasn't legal. So I thought to myself, who would be motivated to go to the Soviet Union? And then I remembered something that I had heard about growing up. And that was that in 1957, yes, believe it or not, the Soviet Union threw a pro-democracy festival.
Once again, the communist world holds a festival of youth, drawing thousands of visitors from both sides of the Iron Curtain. This is the 6th festival and it's in Moscow, but there's a difference. They were designed for the export of ideas, propaganda being reinforced by spectacle, but the communist world, including Russia, is in a ferment, particularly among the youth.
Now, in 1957, this was the time of Nikita Khrushchev, and it was known as Khrushchev's thaw. He had just come to power. He had just exposed Stalin's crimes at the 20th Continental Congress, and he was trying to show that it was a kinder, gentler Soviet Union. And so the idea was he invited people from all over the world, representatives from various countries, to come to this peace festival in Moscow in 1957. If you ever heard the song Moscow Nights, it actually came from this festival. And growing up, I had always heard that after the 1957 World Youth Festival came the Children of the Rainbow. And as you can imagine, it was not a very pleasant experience growing up in the Soviet Union if you were one of the Children of the Rainbow. So these two things came together to me. I said, what if this was an interracial couple in the United States? She was a writer, he was an actor. They had worked together on a soap opera, because Write What You Know, and I had worked for ABC Daytime, for All My Children, One Life to Live, General Hospital, and for Procter & Gamble Productions for Guiding Light, and As the World Turns. So that's a world I definitely knew. And what if this was a couple where he had been a star on the radio, playing a nominally white character? Because you know how they say on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog? Well, on the radio, nobody knows you're an African-American actor. But when the show's about to transition to television, now you have a problem. So he's fired. His fiancée quits. If he goes, I go. And now there they are in America trying to mount a Marxist version of Othello. And yes, there are many Marxist readings of Othello, so that's not something I made up. That's something that exists. And they get an invitation from the 1957 World Youth Festival in Moscow, asking them to come to Moscow and put on their production, their dream production. So they go there, and they're feted, and they're treated like celebrities, and they're isolated from what's really going on in the country, and they believe it. They believe when the Soviet Union says, we've outlawed racism, we've outlawed sexism, we've outlawed anti-Semitism, they go, yeah, that's true. And you can see how a couple like that would buy the propaganda and they would move there. I was also thinking of the great African-American singer Paul Robeson, who made many, many trips to the Soviet Union in the 1930s, who was actually very good friends with the Yiddish actor Solomon Michalkoz. Solomon Michalkoz was, I will say, brutally murdered. The official story is he was in an accident, but he was so badly beaten that they couldn't even have an open coffin. And he had been very good friends with Paul Robeson. And when Paul Robeson accepted the Stalin Peace Prize from Stalin himself, and he was asked about anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union, he said, I have heard of no such thing. And I believe him, because he would have been completely isolated. And this is something that, we've talked about in our household. The fact is, when you are persecuted and when you are discriminated against, you're going to grasp at anything, at anyone who promises you utopia. And especially if you're very good at keeping blinders on. And in fact, the reason that the book is called Go On Pretending is because that's what the characters do. Despite the fact that the whole world is happening around them, they insist on seeing the utopia they were promised, just saying, well, it's just around the corner. If we just keep believing it and we don't make waves, then we're going to get this dream world, but we're going to pretend it's already here.
I'm so glad you mentioned Paul Robeson, because there is that contradiction in his biography. He's such an intellectual, such a well-spoken person, such a thoughtful person who really did get seduced by this propaganda. So it can happen to anyone, as well as you're alluding to.
And him, if he really wanted to believe that there was this world out there, and I don't even know if it's seduced. I feel it's almost like a dual consciousness, which we're now getting into the whole Booker T. Washington and all of that. But it's the fact is, when you really want to believe something, people see what they want to see. People hear what they want to hear. And they keep telling themselves that, okay, it's not perfect. It's not perfect. Nothing is perfect. But if we were to burn it all down, what good would that do anyone? We have to keep making progress. We have to keep moving forward.
Yeah, and another thing that's true about Robeson is he was one of the great singers of Yiddish music.
He was, and there's recordings of him. Well, my parents, I grew up with my parents. He sang a song, Shurakasta na moya rodnaya, which is Wide is My Motherland. And he, of course, had a heavy Russian accent. He had a heavy accent in Russian, an American accent. And so when my parents speak of Paul Robeson, they imitate Shurakasta na moya rodnaya. So that was my first introduction.
Shurakasta na moya rodnaya. Много часов полей рек, я другой такой страны не знаю, где так вольно дышит человек.
But he also was in a movie, which was Stalin's favorite movie. It was called Circus, and it's about an American woman who has a biracial black child, and she's heavily persecuted in America, and she escapes to the Soviet Union, and everyone, of course, there loves her, and the child is not mistreated at all. And in the final number, as Robeson sings How Wide Is My Motherland, she is marching proudly in a Soviet parade with her child. And that's also on YouTube, by the way.
Part of what your books do is give us a glimpse of the everyday lives of people in places where we don't necessarily think about the individual's experience. What comes across, and what we should already know living in the U.S., is that governments aren't the same thing as the people. Is humanizing a goal of your work?
So I grew up in the United States in the 1980s. That was when I went to school. And I don't know if you remember this. Was it Sting who sang Don't the Russians Love Their Children Too? I think it was a big song. And I remember, because I was in my teens, and I remember thinking, yes, Sting, the Russians, they absolutely love their children too. This is in no way relevant to what the Soviet government was doing. So I actually think humanizing has its downside, that if you just go, oh, we're all just people. That's true. We're all just people. But some people have access to uranium that they like to use to hurt other people. So I don't think humanizing is always the right approach. But the flip side of it is people will continue living regardless of what the government is. And people will continue having their dramas, and people will continue having their interpersonal positive and negative interactions. So the answer to your question is yes and no. While I think you can go too far in humanizing and just assume that everyone has the same desires that you do, this whole concept of everyone is the same. No, some people want very different things from other things. But the flip side of that is no matter who's in charge at the top, the people at the bottom are still going to be who they are regardless.
Yeah, that's sort of what I was alluding to. Certainly not humanizing Stalin, but humanizing everyday people trying to struggle and succeed in their own everyday lives.
Absolutely. And actually, the third section of my book, which you mentioned, The Women's Revolution of Syria, which is a story that one of my kids actually told me about. It's an area called Rojava, where they are actually, it's phenomenal. They are holding off ISIS, which are mostly run like cantons. It's not a government from the top down, it's government from the bottom up. And they have very firm rules about how many women need to be on every governing council. And so this was just something that I hadn't heard about until my younger son introduced me to it. So I did want to bring in the fact that there's so many different ways to live even under a government or with a government, that those of us who live in countries, large countries, which sort of have their own you can't say natural structure because obviously men implemented it, but there's sort of a feel like when you're that big, you have to have a different structure, that you have this tiny area, Rojava, which is being run in a very different way. I mean, they say that they've come up with their own way of thinking. They call it genealogy, not with a G, but with a J, and the study of history. But to me, when I read it, it really felt just like classic libertarianism. But once again, don't put labels on it, and that's the whole point. They are functioning the way that works for them, regardless of what they want to call it.
Like you mentioned, as a novelist, there's a lot of write what you know in your books. Do you have any other advice for the aspiring authors in our audience?
So, one of the other pieces of advice that they often give authors is write the book of your heart. That's nice if you just want to write a book. If you want to sell a book, that's something different. Write the book that people want to read. Sorry, that's crass, but you have to understand, I come from commercial television, and commercial television is very much tell the story that people want to watch. So write the book of your heart, but try to see if you can fit it into a genre that people are buying.
Yeah, I guess it helps if you like what everyone else likes.
Well, but here's another thing. I still very often hear people say, romance sells really well. In fact, romance is the best-selling genre. So they say, I'm going to write a romance. And I go, do you read romance? Do you like romance? Because I hear that all the time. I'm going to write science fiction, even though I hate of what's out there. I'm going to write something and it's going to be better. I don't believe, maybe I'm wrong. I can be wrong. In fact, I write a Substack called Literal Literary Loser. So what do I know? But that said, I don't believe you can write in a genre you don't love. I don't believe that you can write in a genre that you don't read. And I hear that all the time, and it blows my mind. In fact, you can go too far in that sort of cynical marketing. You can say, oh, vampire romances are big. I'm going to write a teen vampire romance. If you don't love teen vampire romance, you can't understand what other people love about teen vampire romance, and you're not going to be able to write a successful teen vampire romance. I personally don't like teen vampire romance, which is why I don't write teen vampire romance.
That's a really good point. And I'm reminded of the writers at DC Comics, specifically in the 1960s and 70s, who were kind of struggling under the comics code, all the restrictions that were in place. And they were also trying to reach like a teenage audience that was maybe outgrowing some of their storylines and so forth. But these were like 40, 50, 60-year-old writers who had no connection to teenagers at all. And whenever they tried to do that, it flopped.
It's like, what is that meme? Hello, my fellow young people.
How do you do, fellow kids?
What? So I think that's what it is. Now, my husband's a huge comic book reader, and I do believe that you can actually, with comic books, you don't have to love everything. But if you're going to write, whether it's a comic book or a teen vampire romance or a mystery, you have to have at least embraced the genre enough that if you're going to break rules, you have to know what rules you're breaking, and you have to ask yourself, why are people using these conventions? Why are people enjoying them? So if you're going to break rules, you better have a really good reason for doing it.
Well, that's very good advice. Thank you so much, Alina, for joining us.
Well, thank you. Was I amusing? Tell me, was I amusing?
I believe so.
Okay. So I'm going to do a last-minute amusing plug for my amusing book, which is Go On Pretending by Alina Adams. It's available wherever books are sold. If you want an autographed version, there's a tiny bookstore in Brooklyn called My Biblioteca, where I had my book launch, where I signed copies. So if somebody wants a signed copy, it's My Biblioteca. Otherwise, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all the usual suspects.
And to our audience, now back to your regularly scheduled lives.
Amusing Jews is here to amuse you. If you like being amused, go ahead and click like and subscribe.